There are countries in which alcohol is an element of culture, part of tradition, something present in celebration and in mourning, something that accompanies life as a backdrop, as an addition, as a flavor. And then there is Russia, a country in which alcohol for centuries was something fundamentally different, something that did not so much accompany life as sometimes replace it entirely, something around which time, money, relationships, and hopes were organized, something so deeply woven into the social fabric that attempts to remove it provoked revolts, economic crises, and the mass search for substitutes that were just as or even more toxic. Alcoholism in Russia is not a problem of the social margins, not a matter of a few percent of unlucky people whose fate can be explained by weakness of character or a difficult childhood. Alcoholism in Russia is a phenomenon of demographic, economic, and historical scale, a phenomenon that for decades shaped life expectancy, family structure, election results, labor productivity, and safety on the streets. To understand why it is so large, one must understand where it came from, how it was reinforced for centuries by the very structures of the state, and why none of the attempts to curb it produced lasting effects. Let us begin with the numbers, because the numbers here really are a conversation in themselves. According to World Health Organization data, Russia for a long time occupied leading positions in the world in per capita consumption of pure alcohol. In peak years, this figure exceeded 15 liters of pure alcohol per year for every adult resident, which is 2 to 3 times higher than the European average. By comparison, Poland, a country with not the best reputation in this area, stands at around 11 to 12 liters, which in itself is a worrying figure for public health experts. Russia has for decades surpassed that figure by a wide margin. But these official statistics are still understated because they do not take into account unregistered consumption of homemade alcohol, samagon, which in many regions of Russia is the basic alcoholic drink and which does not appear in any sales registers or tax data. When estimates of unregistered consumption are added to the official figures, total consumption in peak periods could have exceeded 18 or even 20 liters of pure alcohol per adult Russian per year. The health consequences of this scale of consumption are built into Russian demographics in a way that has worried demographers and epidemiologists around the world for years. The average life expectancy of a man in Russia for a long time remained below 65 years. In some regions and in some decades, it approached 60 or even lower. For comparison, a man in Poland lives on average about 74 years, and in Japan or Switzerland, over 80. That difference does not come from genes, does not come from climate, and does not come from the unfathomable Russian soul. It comes to a very large extent from alcohol. Studies by Russian epidemiologists conducted across various regions of the country over decades have consistently indicated that alcohol is the direct or indirect cause of 40 to 50% of all deaths among men of working age. That is, between the 15th and 60th year of life. That is a figure at which every other health risk factor in Russia seems marginal. To understand why, one must go back in history, and not by decades, but by centuries. Vodka in Russia has a history reaching back at least to the 15th century, and the state monopoly on its production and sale appeared very early in the history of Russian statehood. Even in Tsarist times, the sale of alcohol was one of the state's main sources of income. At certain historical moments, it accounted for 30 to 40% of all revenue to the Tsarist budget. This is fundamentally important because it means that for centuries, the Russian state had a vital financial interest in making sure its subjects drank as much as possible. There was no systemic interest in limiting alcohol consumption. On the contrary, there was the opposite interest, strong and structural. State taverns, called kabaks, were scattered throughout the empire and were often the only place of entertainment and social contact available to the ordinary peasant. You came to the kabaks, drank, and left money there, which partly returned to the Tsarist treasury. For centuries, this mechanism worked efficiently from the standpoint of state finances and catastrophically from the standpoint of public health. The Soviet era changed the form, but not the substance, of this relationship between the state and alcohol. Officially, the Soviet Union condemned drunkenness as a relic of capitalist corruption and bourgeois degeneration. In practice, state vodka plants operated at full capacity. Vodka was one of the few consumer goods that was always available in stores, even when there was a shortage of meat, vegetables, and toilet paper. And the price of vodka was kept for years at a level that made it affordable for every manual laborer. Soviet vodka at 3 rubles and 60 kopecks per bottle, for decades unchanged at the same price, became a cultural and economic icon, a symbol of Soviet everyday life, something as lasting and as certain as Soviet power itself. When Mikhail Gorbachev in the year 1985 announced an anti-alcohol campaign, one of the most radical in the history of the USSR, its effects were spectacular, though not solely in the intended direction. Alcohol consumption officially dropped dramatically, the average life expectancy of Russians clearly rose, and GDP growth accelerated because workers were sober and more productive. But at the same time, budget revenues from alcohol sales collapsed, which contributed to the financial crisis of the Soviet state. Sugar disappeared from shops because it was used to make samogon, and people stood in hours-long lines for a bottle of wine or beer. The campaign ended after a few years, and Gorbachev is still mocked for it in Russia today, although health data from that period unequivocally confirm that it saved thousands of human lives. The 1990s brought an alcohol catastrophe on a scale never seen before. The collapse of the USSR, sudden unemployment, inflation devouring life savings, and the loss of a sense of identity and purpose by millions of people who had known all their lives what the system was and where it was headed. All of this together created conditions for an explosion of alcohol consumption of unprecedented intensity. At the same time, the market was flooded with toxic substances sold as alcohol, denatured alcohol, windshield deicer, perfumes with high alcohol content, methyl alcohol passed off as ethyl alcohol, and deaths from alcohol poisoning jumped to unimaginable levels. In the year 1994 and 1995, more than 60,000 people in Russia died annually from alcohol poisoning. 60,000, that is a number exceeding the total losses of many countries in more than one war. Except here, people were dying at kitchen tables and on park benches, with no enemy army at all. Demographers observing Russia in that period used the word catastrophe, and this was not rhetorical exaggeration. The geographical and climatic factor is often cited as an explanation for Russian alcoholism, and there is a grain of truth in that, though no more than a grain. Long and dark winters, months spent under conditions of limited sunlight, frosts reaching -30 or lower in many regions, the spatial isolation of small settlements cut off from the rest of the world for several months a year. These are real factors that affect the psyche and that in many cultures of the cold climatic zone correlate with higher alcohol consumption. Alcohol as a source of warmth, in the physical and psychological sense, is, in the conditions of the Russian winter, something with its own concrete, felt logic. But climate alone does not explain anything sufficiently, because Finland and Sweden have a similar climate and much lower rates of alcohol consumption and alcohol-related mortality, precisely because for decades they pursued active public health policies and built alternative ways of coping with winter and loneliness. The lack of alternatives and the cultural emptiness of the Russian provinces is one of the most important and least discussed factors in alcoholism in this country. A small town without a cinema, without a library open more than 2 days a week, without a sports field in usable condition, without a cafe, without a club, or any institution offering anything to do in the evenings. That is the typical image of the Russian provinces, typical of hundreds of towns and thousands of villages. In such conditions, alcohol is not so much a choice among many possibilities as the only available way to spend time and the only medium of social contact. A social gathering in Russia usually means a bottle, not coffee, not a walk, not a live football match. This results from poverty, from the lack of infrastructure, and from a multi-generational habit that has deeply embedded alcohol as the central element of every social gathering. Refusing to drink at a Russian gathering is an act that requires explanation and is often met with suspicion or offense because it questions the very foundation of the ritual, trust and openness, which in Russian culture are shown through drinking together, not through other forms. Public health policy and the addiction treatment system in Russia have for decades been dramatically inadequate for the scale of the problem. The Soviet approach to alcoholism combined repressive elements with pseudo-medical ones. There were compulsory sobering-up stations, where people were taken off the street, and so-called LTPs, that is, treatment labor prophylactoriums, a kind of compulsory labor camp for chronic alcoholics, where instead of therapy, there was physical work and isolation. These institutions did not treat addiction. They produced people who, after leaving their walls, returned to drinking within weeks or days, because no one dealt with the causes, only the symptoms. After the collapse of the USSR, that system largely fell apart, and nothing equally systemic was created in its place. Private addiction clinics exist, but they are available only to those who can pay for them. And those who could pay for them are rarely the ones who need them most. The public health system has chronic shortages of psychiatrists and psychologists, especially in the provinces. And the stigmatization of alcoholism as a moral weakness rather than an illness means that many addicts never seek help because admitting to the problem is considered shameful. An important, though often overlooked factor, is also the role of political stress and social helplessness in driving alcoholism. In a country where the individual for centuries had very limited influence over his own life, where the Tsar, the party secretary, or the governor decided key matters regardless of the will of the subjects, where protests were suppressed, where reforms came from above or did not come at all, alcohol became one of the few available forms of power over one's own mental state. Leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to watch the next video. Even more truth is waiting there.